relationship seems really very sort of robust at the highest level. And for somebody of Putin's background, he would just automatically assume, given his KGB past, that this sort of stuff is going on. But I suppose it's more a question of what have the Chinese been stealing, how successful are they at this, how integrated are they, do they really have good channels to collect information.
John Lough, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Foreign Policy at the Eurasian Strategies Centre. Thank you so much for joining the Putin Files today.
My pleasure, Maddie.
It's good to have you back on and get your expertise. When it comes to the Putin Files, it's not so much about what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war. It's also about everything else that's happening inside Russia, Vladimir Putin's reign, what he plans to do. And so I think to kickstart this, we need to speak about his ambitions for Russia's navy, because one of his long-term Kremlin aides has confirmed that Vladimir Putin has approved a massive revamp of Russia's navy. We don't know the detail of the entire strategy, but Russia currently has the world's third most impressive navy after the US and China. So are you expecting that the goal here is for Putin to be creating the world's most powerful navy?
I think there's certainly a big emphasis on rebuilding the Navy and equipping it for the challenge, as the Russians see it, of asserting their interests in the Arctic. The Arctic is an area of real interest to them. As global warming proceeds apace, then very interesting opportunities are opening up in the Arctic, and the Russians sense that there is strong competition from other countries there, and they want to stake their position. So they've established this Northern Sea route that effectively can cut the cost of transportation across the world from the US to China, for example. But that's, in fact, although the channel is becoming, during the summer months, easier to navigate, it's still extremely challenging, and I think the economics of that route have to be really demonstrated. But the Russians understand you have to stake a position, and that's what they're doing, I think, quite energetically. And there can be, I think, probably some debate about the quality of ships they're producing at the moment, given the impact of sanctions, but they are churning out a lot of ships.
This strategy, John, it has a 2050 goal to basically completely re-strategize their navy by 2050. But what do you see them investing in a particular sense? Because what we know is that they have around 79 submarines, 14 of them are nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. There's around over 220 warships. So is there an area that they need to improve in, particularly to, face off against China and US for that first-place position?
Yeah, I think they probably need to improve across the board. I mean, we've seen in the case of the war in Ukraine, I mean, it's difficult to ignore what happened to the Black Sea fleet there, that Ukraine, a country basically without a navy, has destroyed about, a third of the Black Sea fleet. It sank the flagship, and it's forced the rest of the Black Sea fleet to retreat to the eastern shores of the Black Sea. So I think that tells you something about probably the vulnerability of the fleet, that a lot of it is very old, and to what extent it's competitive when measured against the capacity of the US Navy or the Chinese Navy. That's open to question. I'm not a naval expert, but I would expect them to be investing heavily in the next generation of ships and weaponry. And at the same time, I would expect to see them putting a lot of effort into building up infrastructure in the Arctic. I think that's their real challenge, of where you actually base these vessels, how you host this capacity without incurring massive costs, because this is not a hospitable part of the world, and the infrastructure there is really very underdeveloped. So the Russians have their work cut out, and remember, at the same time, they're going to have to be rebuilding the ground forces after the debacle in Ukraine. And that's a process that's obviously going to take some years, and it's not just about building new weapons or creating new weapon systems, replacing what's been destroyed, and expanding the new weapon systems that have appeared during this war, particularly drones, and the Russians are doing, actually, in some respects, quite well here, although it seems that Putin is not entirely satisfied with the progress that's being made. But they've also got, I think, the real challenge. I mean, to operate these more sophisticated types of weaponry, you need something very different from the World War II model of staffing the armed forces with simple soldiers who've received basic training and can be put into battle as basically cannon fodder, which is essentially what the Russian army has been doing in Ukraine. But there's a so-called revolution in military affairs now taking place, and this is going to put, I think, really big demands on the way Russia approaches fighting war, the way it prepares. The military system is prepared for this, how its soldiers and officers are trained, and it's going to have to do things differently if it wants to really remain competitive.
How do you see the Kremlin affording this, John? Because we know that Russia's economy has been dwindling. We know that they've been putting so much of their GDP into the military to fund this war. And of course, sanctions and tariffs have had an exponential effect on the Russian economy. So when you need to revamp an entire navy within the next 20 to 25 years, as well as revamp all the losses they've made within their own army, can they afford this?
It's going to be extremely challenging, but I would look at it this way: that the current leadership sees that war or strategic confrontation with the West is what remains of the West is going to remain a priority for the country, and it's a way to preserve their system by simply trying to coalesce around a perceived threat. So they're prepared to put enormous amount of resources into this. They have obviously a quiescent society because they've made it that way. And they indoctrinate the population to persuade people that there is really this threat. Russia has no alternative but to invest in these weapon systems and to rebuild the armed forces. So they have many advantages over democracy when it comes to diverting resources. The problem, however, is what state is their infrastructure left in, and it's all the usual things about schools, hospitals, the education system in general, the degradation of human capital as a result of this sort of distortion in the economy. So they have got big challenges there for sure. But I would also point out that in some respects the Russians are very efficient when it comes to procuring military equipment. They work on the basis of a military doctrine where they work out what they actually need. They are able then to get their weapons producers to design equipment for them and manufacture equipment that really meets their needs. And they have a strong track record of doing this over a number of decades. So compared to many Western countries that often design the equipment and then think about how it can be used, the Russians do it the other way around. And so in that respect, what it costs them to produce, for example, a drone or an artillery shell or something like that, it's vastly cheaper than in the majority of Western countries. So at the moment, they're spending, probably between 6 and 7% of GDP on defense, so less than the Soviet Union did. But I think the real question is here, to what extent those technologies that they want to develop can be developed in the military sector alone. The experience of the Soviet Union was that, for example, microwave technology, whereas that developed very much in the civilian sector in the West, and we had millions of microwave ovens being turned out, already in the late 1980s. These remained locked up in the Soviet defense sector, and so the civilian economy suffered very much as a result. And the other big problem the Russians face is that the type of technological advances we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, these have come largely from Western or have been led by Western countries. And you look at a company like Apple or something like that, and the creativity is I suppose is stimulated by the freedom in society, the freedom to do things. So the Russians, if you create this repressive society where your best brains leave the country because they don't see a future, then you're immediately handicapped. So I think that's a challenge they face.
We've seen last month, especially late May, John, we saw the Russian Navy practicing military drills in the Baltic Sea. Of course, NATO allies and neighbouring countries of the Baltic Sea have kept a very watchful eye over what Russia has been doing with their navy. But when you see Russia conducting these military drills in the Baltic Sea, are they showing that it's a threat to the West? Is that the intention?
Yes, they are. I think you're referring to these it's a NATO exercise called Baltops, which has been underway in recent days, and probably, I don't know, 15, 16, NATO allies involved in that. Large number of ships. I think I saw 9,000 personnel or something like that. So it's a pretty major exercise, and this is part of the annual planning, and it's definitely a way of signaling to the Russians that yes, we do perceive danger in the Baltic Sea. We are well aware that you've been using these ghost ships to drag anchors along the seabed and damage undersea cables. I think there's very good evidence that a lot of activity has been going on in that area, and we're just warning you that we have capacity here, and look at what we've got. And of course, it's always helpful for NATO countries to exercise in this way, to actually test their interoperability, these common procedures, all those sorts of things that military people need to do. So yeah, I think NATO is definitely putting down a marker here and saying that we are vigilant. And now with both Finland and Sweden being members of NATO, there's a different what the Russians call correlation of forces up in the Baltic region. So I am quite sure that the Russian military is paying very close attention to what NATO is doing.
Well, yes, of course, because we saw Russia practicing military drills last month, but of course, yes, these war games, they're taking place right now in the Baltic Sea, headed up by the US Navy. And as you mentioned, there's around 15 countries participating, 15 countries' navies participating, including 8 that border the Baltic Sea, not including Russia, of course. And it very much is to show Russia what we can do. The aim is to show what we can do as we work together against you. And US Vice Admiral J.T. Anderson, he said that this year's Baltops is more than just an exercise. It's a visible demonstration of our alliance's resolve, adaptability, and maritime strength. So when you see these war games playing out, I know that they do take place every year, but is there a difference to this year when we've got such a big war going on with Russia and Ukraine and NATO's involvement? Is that the NATO navies and various countries working together to say, hey, we're ready to prepare for a war if you do take your navy out for an attack?
Well, I mean, let's keep in mind this war's now in Ukraine tragically has been underway for over 3 years. So these are not the first exercises that have been held during that period. But I think against this context, this background of, we had the NATO Secretary General in London on Monday, I believe, encouraging NATO member states to pay their dues and increase their military spending, up to 5% over the longer term. This is a massive increase in defence spending, and this is the rearmament of the European part of NATO, and that's what he is essentially calling for. Of course, the Russians have got to take that very seriously. So I think these latest exercises, they fit into this context. But let's remember also that the Russians are, I think, very interested to know to what extent the United States is still committed to NATO. So yes, formally it's still a member of NATO, but we've got a summit coming up, in just under 2 weeks' time, where I think we're really going to find out what the US wants to do with NATO. Because the European member states are clearly going to demonstrate they're prepared to pay much more to look after their security, and rightly so. The Americans have had a point here for decades that the Europeans have been the free riders in this process, and that's now going to change quite abruptly. Whether that will be enough to persuade President Trump that the United States still derives benefit from NATO and should stay in the alliance, I have no idea, but your, I think, regular guest, John Bolton, has alluded many times to the fact that he was among those, I think it was in 2018, who, before a NATO summit, had to persuade Trump not to actually withdraw the US from NATO. So the Russians, I think, must be asking themselves, is NATO's sort of bark worse than its bite? Are we really going to be dealing with an organization, if push comes to a shove, where the United States is still going to be behind its European allies in the way that it was? And I think that's very much open to question. The European allies are definitely trying to signal to the White House that we've heard your message, we're doing what you need us to do, please stay on board.
You mentioned this before, John, but can you walk me through what Russia's ghost fleet are and why NATO and these neighbouring countries have been keeping such a close eye on them?
Yeah, well, these seem to be ships or vessels, whether they're fishing vessels or something else. I don't think they're oil tankers in this case. We've got a thing called the shadow fleet, which we need to sort of distinguish from this ghost fleet. But these are vessels that, for example, have been spotted in the Baltic Sea, acting suspiciously in some cases. I believe the Estonian authorities forced one such vessel into Estonian waters recently to no doubt search it and then let it go. They tried to apprehend another vessel which simply didn't stop. So there are all sorts of games being played there. And I think what we're finding in today's world is that the Russians are very ingenious when it comes to using unorthodox means to disrupt the way we do things. I think there's probably evidence back indeed in the Soviet days that they used fishing vessels for espionage and other purposes. But I think they've alighted on a new game here. And obviously the security of undersea cables is very, very serious because it's difficult to protect them. I mean, what sort of force are you going to have there, dotted across the Baltic Sea? But I think the coastal states there, both NATO and EU members, I'm quite sure are watching this, tracking this very, very closely to see what sort of vessels are entering those waters and under whose flags they're operating. And I may be wrong, but I think that there have been also Chinese ships in odd places, and questions asked then about what they're doing. So this is the new game, and we have to get equipped to cope with it. And we're behind the curve here, because for so long the belief persisted that the Russians really weren't going to be so troublesome again. Yes, they were difficult in lots of respects. We had disagreements with them, but fundamentally, this relationship was manageable, and that was obviously after February 2022. There's been a radical rethink, but there were so many signals before that, and really in the run-up to 2014 when the Russians annexed Crimea, that we should have been on our guard. But so much of the time, we've really, given the Russians, so to speak, the benefit of the doubt, and thought, well, we can't prove it, but logically, there's no reason why they should want confrontation with us because it would be bad for them. But they haven't seen it that way. The Putin system feels, I think, it has positively benefited from this confrontation, even if they got bogged down in a major war in Ukraine, because they see that the West is now very divided, that its reaction to the war in Ukraine has not been especially effective. You've got lots of doubts being expressed about the wisdom of this sort of longer-term confrontation that we're now headed towards. I was listening to an interview on German radio with somebody from the Social Democrats, from more the sort of, I suppose, the left-wing side of the Social Democrats, saying that we need to be in dialogue with Russia. We need to do things differently. Of course, the Russians have behaved appallingly in Ukraine. Well, we've got to go back to the tradition of Willy Brandt in the 1960s and look at some form of détente, because at the end of the day, Russia is our big neighbour. We can't get away from this. So those are not isolated voices. We're hearing them in a number of places, even if the dominant narrative still is that Europe has to rearm because we have no choice. We've still got to ensure that our societies pay for this. And here is where I think the Russians see an opportunity. They see that our societies are divided, that this sort of process of atomization is maybe likely to continue, and they can exploit it. So using their social media channels, bots, goodness knows what it is, that their messaging in this environment can help to sort of unsettle us further. And then you have the whole MAGA phenomenon in the United States, the way the White House currently views Europe. And there are elements of the Russian system that think, actually, we've got a lot in common here. And maybe the United States is actually going to help us, bizarrely, achieve our objectives in Europe, which is for the US to leave, Europe to become, again, what the Russians refer to as historical Europe. So Europe should sort of revert to what it used to be when there were a number of bigger powers in Europe that decided matters over the heads of smaller countries, and Russia therefore would have a very important seat at the table. So I think the irony here is the Russians, despite this war, they want to get back to Europe. They feel overly dependent on China at the moment. This is an unnatural posture for Russia to be in, to be cut off from Europe and reliant on a partnership with China, which is certainly a robust partnership. I have no doubt about that. These ideas of a reverse Kissinger are really nonsense in my view. That's not going to happen. But they would like to fashion Europe into something that's easier and more comfortable for them to deal with. They would like to make use of technologies from Europe, but what they want to do, this group of people want to do at the same time, is to reject Europe's liberalism, because they see that as toxic.
I know that you've probably read this New York Times article. You mentioned the relationship with China just now, and this New York Times article was really interesting. It basically came out this week that said that some of the journalists had obtained intelligence from a secret Russian intelligence unit that detailed how Russia had a deep suspicion of China. And this was really interesting because they've obviously had this alliance, especially in the last few months. And we saw Xi Jinping attend this VE Day military parade, do this big song and dance with him in Moscow. But the New York Times said that basically Russian spies are worried about China's espionage. They're worried that China's trying to recruit Russian spies to obtain military technology. It said that China has basically been spying on Russian military operations in the war in Ukraine, and they're worried that China would even go so far as to encroach on Russian territory, as they, of course, share this border. So is this surprising to you, or has it always been a suspicious relationship?
No, Maddie, it's not surprising to me at all. I think it's well known that there's distrust on both sides. And I mean, let's look at the relationship between the United States and Europe. Over a long period, it was known that the United States spied on its European allies. Remember the whole story with Angela Merkel's phone being tapped by Americans. And interestingly, it was always an understanding the Europeans would not do this in reverse. So in the case of Russia-China, I think no surprise. I'm aware of the fact that there have been a number of people convicted of espionage offences in Russia in recent years who've been academics, for example, from technical research institutes dealing with maybe sensitive technologies, that they have been charged with offences related to espionage for China. And I think it's perfect. No, I wouldn't say it's perfectly normal in these sorts of relations. These sorts of things do go on. What's interesting in this case, and we haven't seen before, and we have to assume that these documents are genuine. I think a number of Western intelligence services have said that they look pretty genuine. That to see a Russian source writing about this threat openly. In very clear terms. I thought this was absolutely fascinating reading, that they see the Chinese as being so active at the moment. But it may have, this may have got more difficult for the Chinese in recent years as the Russian system has started to tighten up. But we've always assumed that it's really been on the lookout for Western spies rather than Chinese spies. So. To what extent this will impact the relationship, I don't know. The relationship seems really very sort of robust at the highest level, and for somebody of Putin's background, he would just automatically assume, given his KGB past, that this sort of stuff is going on. But I suppose it's more a question of what have the Chinese been stealing, how successful are they at this, how integrated are they, do they really have good channels to collect information. But Russia, is an amazing place, despite this very repressive system. Let's say the amount of leakage of sensitive documents or just badly protected databases, all that sort of thing. It is phenomenal. So the fact that this document has come to light is probably further evidence of that.
The more, just a final question, John. We know that they spy, we know that they gather intelligence from various countries, but the thought of Russia being concerned about China encroaching on its territory. I mean, do we ever see a world in which we'd see Chinese soldiers invade Russia?
I mean, I find that hard to believe. I mean, who knows? Of course, when Putin and his colleagues leave the Kremlin, we maybe have a leadership change in China as well, how that relationship might develop. It sort of seems at the moment that it's very stable. Both countries need the other, and there's no reason to assume that it will be disrupted. But if history is a guide, then yes, of course, the Russians and the Chinese have had their border issues in the past. You might expect those to re-emerge, but what I think is probably more likely is that just the economic power of China will impact Russia more extensively, particularly in the far east of the country, parts of Siberia, where they might be colonized economically by China. And given Russia's challenges in just developing those parts of the country, or even maintaining its presence in some of them, particularly in Siberia, then that Chinese ability to build an infrastructure very cheaply, to no doubt construct housing, all these things that can really make a difference, then it just may be logical that Chinese influence extends further. So I think longer term Russia has to be very concerned about that. And then you get back to the question of how far does Russia's sovereignty really extend into Siberia? I mean, if we're looking 50 years ahead, that might be an important question to answer. But short term, I think the Russian-Chinese relations, from what I see, are in pretty good shape, even if the Chinese are probably not over impressed by the way the Russian army has performed so badly in Ukraine, that Putin miscalculated over Ukraine. I don't think they necessarily saw this coming, but they've seen that they've really got no option but to really sort of stand by Russia's side. So despite all this talk about peace and diplomacy and all the rest of it, China's not really up for this. And it seems sort of quite comfortable, I think, in some ways, to let this war go on, because they see that it's putting the West under strain, and it's putting the United States in a position where it's in a dilemma, effectively. How much effort does it still expend on Europe, when at the same time it's got to think about what's going on in the Asia-Pacific region.
John Lough, thank you so much for joining the Putin Files today.
Thank you very much, Maddie. It's great to talk with you.